From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Liz Truss resigns as British Prime Minister after a mere 6 weeks amid a Conservative Party revolt and market turmoil. What's next for the United Kingdom, and what are the lessons for others, including the United States? Plus, President Biden tries to calm fears of the public over energy prices and talk down gasoline prices, which have been rising again ahead of the election and bodes ill for Democrats. Will any of what he's doing make a difference? Welcome, Joe Sternberg and Kim Strassel are my colleagues today who are here. Let's start it off with the fiasco in Britain and a couple of clips from Liz Truss about why she is stepping down and what she thinks she accomplished.
We delivered on energy bills and on cutting national insurance. And we set out a vision for a low-tax, high-growth economy that would take advantage of the freedoms of Brexit. I recognise, though, given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party. This morning I met the chairman of the 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady. We've agreed that there will be a leadership election to be completed within the next week. I came into office at a time of great economic and international instability. Families and businesses were worried about how to pay their bills. Putin's illegal war in Ukraine threatens the security of our whole continent. And our country has been held back for too long by low economic growth.
Well, Joe, she's absolutely right. Her country has been held back for too long by too low economic growth, low productivity, as you have chronicled for us over these several years. I hate to break it to her, but that's her party who's been presiding there for the decade. And yes, Vladimir Putin has created some of the problems currently, but not nearly all of them. He didn't bring across 10% inflation. He didn't bring across soaring energy prices because they can't produce enough energy at home. And he didn't introduce all the tax cuts that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak introduced before they were pretty much ousted from power. And now Liz Truss becomes the scapegoat for the Tory party.
Yes, I mean, it was a really fantastic rise and fall in terms of British politics. I think she's going to be the shortest serving prime minister in British political history. And ultimately, the problem was the Conservative Party, because, certainly they have been in power for 12 years at this point. That is always the point in any political cycle where a governing party, kind of the rot starts to set in, it runs out of ideas, it runs out of energy. And the Tories were hitting that wall at exactly the time that this economic crisis had developed, partly because of the failure of the policies that big government Tories had implemented over the preceding 12 years. And I think that Truss's big project had been to try to shake the party first and then the country out of that torpor. She came in, the big part of this had been her 2.5% GDP growth target, which was quite high compared to what Britain had been accomplishing before that. And that had brought with it a whole bunch of tax cut and deregulation policies that she wanted to really zero in on incentives for productive investment and economic growth and work. And unfortunately, the party just was not ready for that. They hadn't had a leader offering that kind of message for a couple decades at this point. They were not equipped to sell it to the voters. A lot of Tory members of parliament didn't seem to understand that themselves. And I think that Truss has concluded that she was trying to lead a party in a direction that her members of parliament particularly were just not prepared to follow.
And the backbiting and essentially undermining from within that took place was quite the spectacle. And of course, they're all blaming her economic proposal, and especially the tax cuts that she and the former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng had produced, which did coincide with a market fall in the sterling and rise in bond yields in the UK, which created the crisis of confidence. But that happened to also coincide with problems on the pension funds, Joe, who had taken some bad bets on trying to get higher returns during the inflationary era. And I think that's just the timing is inconvenient here for her and the tax cuts, but a policy that lasted 2 weeks as a proposal and never became law, you can't blame it for the distress that the UK economy is in right now.
Right. I think that the specific event that we're talking about here is that on Friday, September 23rd, former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng had come out with this big tax cut plan. And I think that Truss and Kwarteng did make one sort of political mistake with that, and that is that they didn't communicate really effectively about what they were doing, and particularly when it became clear that markets and a lot of other politicians within their own party didn't understand how they had arrived at the specific suite of tax policies that they had come up with and how these policies would relate to investment and economic growth. I think that Truss and Kwarteng did not do a very good job of explaining that and persuading people. So they missed some opportunities they might have had to turn things around. The underlying problem, though, is that this should not have been a major event in the markets, except that they happened to be unleashing a radical new form of economic policy for the UK at a moment when Britain was particularly vulnerable financially because it has been laboring under very low interest rates for 10 to 15 years. It's been laboring under very low productivity growth as a result of a lot of the policies that had come before. And so I think that it was sort of that ecosystem that allowed what perhaps would ordinarily have only been a slight market hiccup on the day to suddenly spiral out of control because they triggered this chain reaction in the financial markets as a result of these pre-existing conditions that I don't think that Truss and Kwarteng had really understood was a possibility because no one had realized that that was a possibility until it happened.
Kim, where do the Tories go next? Some talk about Boris Johnson being hauled back into power. I think he'd be a fool to take it. Rishi Sunak, who had competed as the finalist with Truss to become prime minister, former chancellor, he may be the next up. Jeremy Hunt, who was the replacement for Kwarteng, that Liz Truss named chancellor, the current chancellor, he's supposedly a possibility. My own preference would be at this stage to have Rishi Sunak get the job as a kind of rough justice. He helped to create this economic mess, and he should have to clean it up. And with Liz Truss no longer around to blame, I suppose they'll try to blame her for her 6 weeks in power for the next 2 years. But I don't think they can pull that off. Voters are smarter than that. With her no longer to kick around as the scapegoat, they'll have to live with the consequences of Mr. Sunak's policies.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, I think Jeremy Hunt would be a close second on the whole Schadenfreude level. I'd be okay with that as well, too, on the rough justice front. But I think the one thing that you can guarantee is that whatever face, whatever person bubbles up here now, it's going to be a return to the Boris policies that got Britain into this situation in the first place. And, I actually think Joe is being a little polite to some of the Tories out there, the ankle biters that really brought down Liz Truss in suggesting they haven't governed this way in a long time. And she was a very bold idea. Well, yeah, but you don't have to be a genius to understand basic pro-growth policies. They had one of the masters of that of all time, Margaret Thatcher. Anyone who knows their British history understands her willingness to sort of stand up against the media assaults and the anger and even public disapproval until what she did really began to work and help the British economy. So what Liz Truss was proposing might have been a different course for the Tories than they had had in a while, but certainly not something that was completely unfamiliar. They just chose not to do it. It's more comfortable for them to be in a place where they are doing Labour Party light, as it were, with handouts and the green initiatives, and we'll all feel happy and slowly trudge your country to a welfare state. That's the comfortable position. So we'll see what comes out of this leadership election. But I think the very sad thing is not that Liz Truss is gone, but that her ideas were taken with her, and that wing of the party has effectively been muzzled.
Joe, where do you think this goes? And the Labor Party's demanding an election now. There isn't one that has to be held until January of 2025, as I recall. So the Tories could hold out if they can stay unified. I sympathize with Keir Starmer, head of the Labor Party, when he requests an election because the Tories have been such a botched effort that the country almost needs a fresh start. But I suppose the Tories will try to tough it out with some replacement as long as they can.
Yes, I think that is what the strategy is likely to be, because the big problem here is actually the 2019 election. That's the one that Boris Johnson won with a historic majority of 80 seats. Many of those were seats that the Conservatives won for the first time in what had been the Labour Party heartlands in the north of England. And so you now have a lot of these members of parliament floating around, or those MPs who don't understand that the next election was always going to be difficult for them. They won because Brexit was still a big issue in the 2019 election. Boris's charisma seemed untouchable at that point. He hadn't been damaged by the bad economic results or some of the scandals that had floated around his administration in the years since then. And so I think that a lot of the political problem that the Conservatives have right now is that crop of MPs who don't seem to understand what's going on around them, who didn't get that the Truss growth plan was the best shot that they might have had to persuade their voters that life could be better under the Conservatives, and who don't realize that they're still going to be vulnerable to the Labour Party no matter who is leading the Conservatives at this point. But it's going to be a very difficult environment if the Tories do try to tough it out for the 2 years that are left before they have to call an election, because they don't really have a mandate now. The last time the public voted for them, it was in 2019 with Boris Johnson and a completely different set of issues. And the Conservative Party has changed its tune and its leaders so many times since then that I fear that we're going to see an extended period of governing chaos in the UK until we get to that next election.